Hello and welcome to the Asian Peace Talks. This is a podcast series launched by the Asian Peace Program of the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. The goal of the Asian Peace Program is a noble one, to try to preserve and strengthen peace in Asia. With our limited resources, we have to take a modest approach. Nonetheless, just as a small acupuncture needle can make a big difference, we hope that our monthly policy essays and this podcast series will make a big difference and strengthen the peace regimes in Asia. I am Kishore Mahbubani, the host of the Asian Peace Talks. After a somewhat long break, I have to confess, we are back with our 9th episode. This episode is part of a series that we call the Asian Voices for Peace. For this episode, we are delighted to interview one of the foremost experts on Indian foreign policy, Professor Kanti Bajpai, to talk about India's relations with China and Pakistan, which, as we all know, are somewhat challenged today. Kanti Bajpai is the Vice Dean of Research and Development and the Wilmar Professor of Asian Studies at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, NUS. He has previously taught at Oxford University, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and the Maharaja Sayajirao University. He has also written extensively on India's foreign policy. Thank you, Kanti, for joining us again, especially before you return home to India after a long and fruitful stint at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I'm going to begin our conversation today by talking about the India-Pakistan relationship, even though most of our conversation today will be about the India-China relationship. As we all know, a horrific terrorist attack took place in Kashmir on 22nd April. 28 innocent civilians were killed by terrorists. And on 7th May, India decided that it had to respond by bombing sites in Pakistan and Pakistan-administered Kashmir. This resulted, of course, in a lot of damage. And after the May 7 bombings by India, there were various other actions that had been taken place. Now, we are taping this podcast on Friday, 9th May. It's clear that India and Pakistan seem to be once again on a sort of a downward spiral. So my first questions to you are, realistically, can the international community do anything to restrain both sides? If so, which countries are most likely to be effective in restraining India and Pakistan from going into a much worse situation?
Well, first of all, Kishore, thanks so much for having me on this talk series again. I'm very happy to be here. And as you say, it's kind of my swan song as I head back to India upon retirement. On your question, I think the clearest thing we can say now, a couple of weeks into the crisis, is that no outside power seems to have had much of an influence. China, the United States, and Saudi Arabia are probably the three most influential powers. The United States with both sides, both India and Pakistan. China to a lesser degree with India, but much more so with Pakistan. And Saudi Arabia has quite a good relationship with both India and Pakistan. And just recently, the Saudi foreign minister suddenly dropped in to India after a visit to Pakistan as well, right in the midst of the crisis. So the Americans have said that they're not particularly interested in getting involved very much. J.D. Vance said it's not America's business. On the other hand, Marco Rubio has been in touch with both governments. The Chinese have supported Pakistan's right to security and have counseled both sides to be restrained. I think the Saudis have said less publicly, but they're working behind the scenes much more. On the other hand, having said all that, obviously the conflict is not in full swing, but there's artillery fire across the line of control and probably now the international border as well. And there have been missile and perhaps aeroplane strikes as well. So it seems that at the moment in this early stage, they're fairly immune to external intervention and are looking to exact a certain amount of toll or revenge on both sides. The one other good point, just to mention along the way, is that it seems that the two national security advisors are in fairly regular touch, which suggests that they're attentive to the problem of escalation and want to try and control it.
Well, I must say, I'm very glad you mentioned the last point, that the national security advisors are in touch with each other, because that shows that communication is very important in times like this. Now I'm going to take a slightly sort of longer helicopter view of the relationship between India and Pakistan. They've had a separation, as we all know, in 1947, 78 years ago. But unlike other countries which have also experienced bitter separations, like Malaysia and Singapore, for example, India and Pakistan, after 78 years, have never been able to ever seriously normalize their relationship. For example, they don't even have normal trade relations. So what do you see as, leaving aside personalities and events, what are the structural reasons for the failure of India and Pakistan to normalize their relationship along the lines of other countries which also have had bitter problems in the past?
Well, the good news is that they have tried and in the past have had some successes. So it's not true that they've never normalized at all. Sadly, but I guess after each war, they've had to come together to broker some sorts of agreements. I say sadly because of the war, but positively, they did try to normalize after each war, including to have normal trade relations, which broke down in the late 1950s. But in each case, in 1965, 66, when the Soviets brokered an agreement, in 1971, when they brokered an agreement bilaterally after the Bangladesh War, in 98, 99, they again had agreements in the wake of the Kargil War. And each time they've signaled a normalization of diplomatic relations and also trade. Unfortunately, I think Pakistan has never been quite able to get to the point of giving India MFN for domestic political reasons mostly, perhaps some domestic economic lobbying by certain companies and so on. But I think the big problem for Pakistan on this issue of trade has been that they fear an India trade lobby might develop within Pakistan and become, a kind of influence. So trade might become a channel or a vehicle for Indian influence within Pakistan. I think that's, I remember years ago when I interviewed Pakistani economists and decision makers, many of them said that quite apart from the economic logic, which is a positive one, it's the diplomatic and concern about the transmission of influence through trade that makes them afraid of giving India MFN. So trade is kind of always there in the conversation, but we never seem to quite get to it. I think the real structural problem, though, of course, is Kashmir, which is what sparked this crisis as well. And that has, it's not just territory, because Kashmir itself as a territorial unit is not very big, but it's the identity and the symbolism of the national identity of these two countries, which are mixed up with Kashmir. It's a Muslim majority province, and Pakistan thinks that by the logic of partition in 1947, they should have got Kashmir because all Muslim majority areas were supposed to be part of West Pakistan. The Indians say that the ruler of Kashmir, who happened to be a Hindu Maharaja, legally acceded to India, and so they have a right to the territory. But more importantly, it confirms the fact that in a secular India, a Muslim majority province can be happy. And so it's important for India's secular kind of national identity as well. So I think the really big tussle is kind of over this, the symbolism or the meaning of Kashmir to both sides. And that's a much more difficult thing to get over or get past.
In many of such territorial disputes, at some point in time, people just say, okay, let's accept the line of control. I mean, we'll never be able to move the borders. Is anyone advocating that? Why not just accept the line of control?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked me that, because in 2006, 2007, General Musharraf of Pakistan and Manmohan Singh of India nearly pulled off exactly that. An agreement that would essentially have sanctified what is today the line of control. In effect, it would have been that, although they wouldn't have formally, legally agreed to a partition of the state. But Manmohan Singh said, let's keep what we have, but let's have it as a kind of soft border. People from the two parts of Kashmir without visas could probably go back and forth. There would be more border trade. More interestingly, the two agreed that there would be municipal functions in common. So things relating to tourism or water, which they share, and certain other kinds of social and welfare kinds of projects that cut across the boundaries or could cut across the boundaries would be dealt with jointly. And the last part was that the relationship of the two parts of Kashmir to their central governments, that they would try and make sure that they were about the same, so that the kind of governance structure broadly would be similar in the two parts of Kashmir. So, yeah, in effect, this was let's agree to keep what we have along the present line of control and effectively unify the social and economic and political life. Sadly, at the last moment, it fell through. Musharraf fell from power when he fell out with the judiciary in Pakistan. And Manmohan Singh wasn't able to persuade even his own Congress party colleagues in the cabinet, very senior members, that it was a workable deal. And the moment passed. So it's long been on the table. The two leaders almost got us there. And then domestic politics intervened.
Well, I'm very glad you mentioned that episode. It showed that for brief moments there were opportunities of finding a reconciliation within the two countries. And it's good to have that still, because you never know when they can go back to it. But in the meantime, before we turn to go to India and China, as you know, the goal of the Asian Peace Program is to promote peace in Asia by coming up with small suggestions that could help to improve relations among Asian countries which have troubled relationships. If you were to suggest a few baby steps that India and Pakistan could take to normalize their relations, what would you give as examples of small, I guess they also call them confidence-building measures, CBMs?
Yeah, I mean, at this moment, it's probably pointless to talk about small and baby steps. We've got to get this conflict settled and stabilized and get past it. And then after some decent interval, I think there are a few things. I mean, for instance, there are a couple of agreements that already exist on the Siachen Glacier dispute, which is also in Kashmir, on the Tulbul water project, which is also relevant to the water dispute between them, and also is in Kashmir. I mean, these would, and the Sir Creek dispute. Sir Creek is, India and Pakistan have a dispute over an estuary, basically, in the Arabian Sea, so way down south. And they did come up with 3 agreements in the early 1990s. And again, domestic politics stopped those going through legally and finally. But they're available. And without prejudice to the final settlement of Kashmir, they could dust off 1 or 2 of these. It's not plausible right now. There's too much bitterness. But with a decent interval, and once we get past this episode, they're kind of baby steps because the agreements already exist. And they're quite reasonable, rational agreements that they nearly signed. So I think that's one. They have an agreement on a ceasefire along the line of control, which the two armies were observing until this crisis blew up. So I suppose they could modify that and resurrect that in light of what they've just learned. But the third and most important thing, I think, is that, and this is probably more Pakistan's responsibility, they're probably going to have to demonstrate some greater control over these extremist groups, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Lashkar-e-Toiba, the Hizbul Mujahideen. And there's not much India can do about reining those in. And so the Pakistani government, on the funding, on having these very big mosques and schools around their facilities, have to try and intervene there to do something more, I think, to reassure India. Now, is that a baby step? I mean, in the larger scheme of things, yes, because it's not an ultimate solution of all quarrels, but it's probably a doable one. And in the past, I mean, the Pakistani government did take some steps, also in line with, FATF, the financial agreement globally that enforces constraints on funding and the movement of funds to terrorist outfits. And so Pakistan has used that to try and do something, but it needs to do more, I think. So that's kind of a baby step, I think, for Pakistan to do. Maybe eventually then, they can come back to trade as well.
Well, thank you, at least, for giving us some suggestions, because it's important to always keep them in mind if we decide one day that the time has come to improve the relationship. And now we're going to turn to also another troubled relationship, the India-China relationship, on which you have written about quite a bit. And as you know, things were going reasonably well between the two countries until the very unfortunate June 2020 Galwan clashes. And that set back relations for many years. And it looked as though it would remain difficult and fraught, but there was a kind of a breakthrough agreement in October 2024 at the border, which came as a surprise to many of us, because before this, it was all negative. So against this backdrop, did you see this October 2024 agreement coming? And if so, what were the factors that led to India and China to sign this border agreement? And has it improved trust between India and China?
Actually, I did kind of have a sense that it was coming. I know you don't want to refer too much to personalities and so on, but in this case, I think it's important to say something about Modi, Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, because he's always had a sense of looking up to China for what it's achieved. I mean, I wouldn't say he loves China, but he recognizes that something monumental has happened there developmentally. And he's constantly, been studying China. He, as chief minister, he went there many times. He received Chinese business delegations. When he was out of favor with the Western powers, when he was chief minister, China didn't give up on him. So I think he remembers that very well. And I think he made an effort in the first term of his in office to reach out to Xi Jinping, and likewise the Chinese reciprocated up to a point. So I think he's always been a force within the government for a fairly calm, pragmatic view of China and what the link with China can do for India, especially economically. Of course, other forces have not been so positive probably in India. And so I think that's the first point, is that Modi has kept an eye on China and its achievements and seen sort of positivity for India there. And when in the run-up to the 2024 elections, he gave an interview with the Financial Times where he said that, China is a very important country for us and we must have a good relationship with it. This can't go on forever. That was kind of the tone of his message. So I think that reinforced my view that, a time will come when India under Narendra Modi will make a bid to repair the relationship. And just as a semi-joking kind of idea, I had a feeling that if he'd won the election big, that in a third term, with a view to legacy and to his broader sense that a stable relation and productive relationship with China was important, that he might have done something ambitious, or in terms of a settlement of the dispute, the boundary dispute. But he didn't win the election big, and so again, domestic forces probably a constraint on him. So I think that's the first thing. I think coming to the more generic sort of reasoning for why this happened. I think the first is that after Galwan, 4 years on, with a deployment of 60,000, 70,000 troops in advanced positions in very hostile geographical locations, the extreme cold and so on and so forth, they both know that there's no military solution. And these troops and equipment are being exposed to very harsh weather. So I think the futility of a kind of military confrontation in that zone, I think, has come home to both militaries and governments. The second is economic. I think it's very clear that India, which has grown at about 7% per annum over 30 years, has kind of understood that if it doesn't have an economic relationship with China, it can't go beyond that 6 or 7% threshold. because the Chinese economy is too big. India needs all kinds of stuff from China, and including investment. And it just can't seem to get past 7%, I think, without integrating more with China. And for the Chinese, with the sharpening of all the troubles with America on economics, even during Biden's time, indeed worse during Biden's time, if anything, and now with the specter of Trump by November last year, I think the Chinese are looking for other big markets. And India's 1.4 billion people, the largest country on earth in population terms. I mean, that's a massive market right on your doorstep. And China wants more flexibility and diversity in its economic relations. So I think that was the second factor that has been pushing them. And it's interesting that since then, India has been gradually opening up and going back to a more normalized trade relationship with China. And the third force is a political one, which is, I think India doesn't looking at America, New Delhi has always had an edgy relationship. I mean, there's cooperation, there's the China factor in common, and so on. But on political issues, human rights, democratic backsliding, the place of minorities in India, every time the Americans wag their fingers at India, that sticks in the Indian craw, I think. And so there's a political problem there, especially with a conservative-minded government like Narendra Modi's, which just doesn't like foreign commentary on India's domestic politics, even more so than other Indian governments. The Chinese have a very similar problem. They are even more neuralgic about American commentary on Xinjiang or Tibet or the lack of democracy and human rights and so on. So in fact, they, in that sense, they have a kind of common cause and would rather be, together diplomatically, politically on the world stage than against America, tacitly at least. And I think and last point, which is related, is that to this third point, is that, on many global public goods issues, they are closer to each other than they are to the Americans. Climate change, the world economy, humanitarian intervention issues, peacekeeping, all those kinds of things, the internet, and the broad issue of state sovereignty above transcendent global norms. I think that brings them together.
Well, I'm really glad you spelled it out so clearly. It's personality, it's economics, it's geopolitical alignments, and in agreement on global public issues.
And the military stalemate. Yeah.
That's right. And at the same time, can you just briefly describe the October 2024 agreement to our listeners? What's the essence of that agreement?
I mean, at the heart of it is the idea that there will be troop reductions in those forward areas. In the most forward areas, they will be pulled back gradually with some timetabling and scheduling. And secondly, to try and make sure that they don't run into each other, patrols and so on, that they will create buffer zones. This, I think, is more a Chinese idea. I think the Indians have gradually come to accept it and understand that it's probably a creative idea, given the difficulties. And so I think that's at the core of it is that. Now, having said that, they probably have to keep monitoring the elements of the agreement to make sure they're actually being implemented on the ground by these patrols and forward positions and so on. But that's the heart of it. And so it's gradual disengagement of the forces and then the installation of a permanent kind of semi-permanent buffer zone. And I think allied to that was an agreement that they will go back to discussions on the border settlement, which it was interrupted by Galwan. From 1981 to 2020, when Galwan happened, almost without interruption, they've had some form of border negotiations. It didn't yield an agreement, but they were continuous. And I think as a result of the agreement in 2024, they have returned to that dialogue between the two national security advisors.
Talking of the border, are there any other small steps that they can take, you think, to avoid the recurrence of such a clash?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said...
As you know, in one of your articles for the Asian Peace Program, you suggested putting technological sensors at the borders, for example.
Yeah. And I think subsequent to that, I mean, not because they read my piece necessarily or anything like that, but because it is a sensible solution in a technological age. I did read that they've either discussed that or already deployed some forms of passive monitoring systems at certain points. So I think they could deepen that if the experience has been a positive one with it. They both have satellites and so on. So it seems like they should be able to do a much better job of that, to increase the density of those kinds of ways of dealing with any border frictions. The second is, I think what's emerging is that they probably have an agreement on kind of when to patrol. So the Indians will go up at this point and check it out, and the Chinese go at another point. This kind of tacit division of patrolling labor, if you like, existed prior to Galwan. I think it may be resuming, and that's a good step to stay with. I think the NSAs have to be in touch regularly.
The National Security Advisors.
The two National Security Advisors.
Yeah.
And that's resumed. So that's good. And I think being able to pick up the phone to each other regularly and so on is very important. And I think the other big thing is the one I mentioned earlier, which is that the economic relationship seems to be resuming, partly because of Trump and the tariffs, but even prior to that. And so, that, and then, direct flights from India to China have resumed and vice versa, which had stopped. The flow of students is still from India, particularly to China, is still pretty massive. So, I think facilitating that, ensuring it continues, having the broader diplomatic and military dialogue, those are things for now that I think are good steps.
Well, no, I think maybe we should, since you mentioned resumption of flights and all that, we can move on from the border to a larger relationship. And here too, there's tremendous potential, for a stronger relationship, especially economic relationship between China and India. But as we all know, it's very much under fulfilled. And and both sides have restrictions. I mean, for example, India has effectively banned Chinese investments. A Chinese electric car company, BYD, is not allowed to invest in India. Similarly, India has refrained from joining the RCEP. So against this backdrop, what do you think are the baby steps that countries can take to gradually normalize the economic relationship?
Well, again, I mean, I think the first thing which China has already signaled, to be fair, is that they're going to look at how Indian exports to China can be facilitated, because there's, as you know, a huge trade gap. Last year, I think bilateral trade was the largest for India. It was about 120 billion, but the balance is $100 billion balances in favor of China. So India barely exports 20 billion worth of goods to China. So I think this has been a sticking point for years, but Beijing has signaled recently, especially after Trump arrived, that they're going to be looking at how to try and improve the flow of Indian goods to China. So I think that's a relative, I guess you could call that a baby step. It's not a macro kind of solution to the overall rivalry and border problem, but it would really assuage a lot of Indian worries and fears. I think on the Indian side, given what's happened with Trump and the tariffs and so on, and if India is going to strike a deal with the Americans on tariffs, lower tariffs, and there are Indian economists arguing now that the positive of the Trump bombshell on tariffs is that India may have to lower tariffs, and that's good for India, good for the economy. Which means possibly that India could find its way back to the RCEP that you mentioned. By the way, the agreement with the trade deal with the UK just a couple of days ago does have some ESG elements there, which is generally a sticking point for India. When it does trade deals, it doesn't like that. And I think there isn't much of that in the RCEP. The big worry there is Chinese economic dominance. But I think India is limbering up on trade now as a result of Trump, and so it may find a way back to the RCEP. If it's going to have troubles with the Americans, then perhaps it needs to come back to the East Asian economy. And so I think, that's another possibility. And it's being talked about a little bit in quite high places in India.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because there's a study by the Peterson Institute for International Economics which says that, quote, India's income will increase by $60 billion annually if it rejoins RCEP, and will fall by $6 billion if it does not. So clearly the economic argument for joining RCEP is very strong. And as you pointed out, even without joining RCEP, India already has a substantive trade deficit actually of $112 billion in 2024. So the arguments for joining RCEP are very strong. But why aren't there more Indian economists publicly advocating that India does something that is actually in the long-term interest of India?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm going to take a guess at some of the explanation. I think part of it may be that Indian economists are a little bit in the shadow of the government. If the government doesn't want the RCEP, I don't think they want to contradict the government very publicly. And so that's probably one good reason. The second is quite a lot of Indian economists are quite protectionist-minded even now. So it's not that they're afraid of the government and are afraid of contradicting the government in public, but they quite agree with the government and feel that, joining the RCEP means more of a deficit with China, Chinese goods flooding into India and undermining local production. So, they concur with the RCEP decision. But what's this tumult that the global economy is in now with Trump may cause, things to move. The one difficulty is going to be this, which is that if India cuts a deal with the Americans on tariffs, which somehow is bad for China, because the Americans are very keen that Australia and Japan and the South Koreans and India and so on, 5 or 6 of these big trading partners of China, join it in a kind of economic front against China. So if that's the Trump vision of a trade deal with India, then there's going to be a problem with China. And the Chinese have already warned, not just India, but everyone at large, saying, if there are third-party deals, particularly deals with the Americans that are intended to hurt China, then China will take actions. So that's one worry I have. It'll be very interesting to see what kind of deal India cuts on trade and tariffs with the Americans.
Yeah, you're right. The Chinese have expressed a lot of concern over that. The other area where India and China both play a major role in, of course, is in the global south. And quite naturally, many countries in the global south look to both China and India to provide some kind of leadership and, in fact, support too. And frankly, during COVID, China and India were much more generous with their vaccines than the Western countries were in helping the countries of the global south. And of course, in the area of infrastructure, China has done a lot in the global south. Now, in theory, both countries will be better off if they tried to cooperate in the global south rather than engage in a negative zero-sum competition. But at the same time, the idea of India-China cooperation in the global south is not even discussed or mentioned. So can you think of some good arguments that we can put across to both countries to persuade them that in addition to the normal competition, can they also look at the possibility of working together in the global south for the benefit of the global south countries and for their mutual benefit too?
Well, yeah. I think particularly, let's say, in Africa or Latin America or even parts of Asia, they are competing at the moment for resources, metals or gas and oil and so on. They're competing for status and influence in these countries as well. They both give overseas development assistance. China, of course, far outpaces India in all of these theaters. So in that sense, there's not much of a competition, to be honest. Although in the minds of the Indians and Chinese, there is a competitive kind of feel when they see each other in these different parts of the world with their trade and diplomatic delegations and so on. But I think broadly, they're beyond the kind of material interests they have in these regions. They want the support of the global South essentially against the West, the powerful West, and the United States, the Europeans. And, here again, I mean, global public goods is one area where they're much closer to the global South than than the Western countries are. So, it's a natural constituency for them. So I think, the broad proposition would be that they will both do well to cultivate the global South, because the global South will then be more supportive of their aims diplomatically against the West. But, also in dealing with global public goods, which the global South has an enormous stake in, particularly climate change, particularly developmental issues, global health issues, energy, the energy transition, all education issues. So I think, doing good together here will in the long term come back to help China and India. Global South will host them in terms of economic investments or trade and so on, sell their resources to them in a much better frame of mind if China and India are partners. And I think the real payoff for India and China to do it together is that it's a waste of their resources to compete. It allows, to be a bit cynical about it, allows countries in the global South to exploit both of them, the division between them to do better. So, there are all kinds of efficiency arguments, more normative arguments, do good together and get payback in terms of access to the resources of these countries, but also their backing on global public goods issues, which are important to everyone.
Well, I hope they will listen to you. Now, let's finally conclude our conversation by discussing Southeast Asia, where we are. And I guess when you lived in Singapore now for 14 years, you've actually been part of Southeast Asia. And what I find somewhat strange about the Indian-Southeast Asian relationship is that even though 9 out of the 10 Southeast Asian countries, with the exception of Vietnam, have an Indic base, and the Ramayana, Mahabharata are very much part of Southeast Asian cultures. And in his recent book, The Golden Road, William Dalrymple points out how amazingly the largest Hindu kingdom in history, the Angko Khmer kingdom, was in Southeast Asia, not in India. And yet there's surprisingly within India today very little interest in Southeast Asia compared to China. And China is investing a lot more in terms of developing ties with the part of the world which is culturally much closer to India than to China. And in fact, China's trade with ASEAN is now 7 times that of India's trade. So my broad question here is, how aware are Indian policymakers of the strong traditional links between India and Southeast Asia? And do they see Southeast Asia as a priority for India in terms of its long-term geopolitical priorities?
I certainly think that Indian elites, I don't know about at the popular level, but Indian elites certainly have a sense of, the ties of India historically to Southeast Asia. Many travel here now, to Thailand, to Singapore, to Malaysia. Which Indian elite doesn't have a relative in Singapore, for instance, to Indonesia and so on. So I think they are aware of those ties. But I think one of the things that has held India back, going back even to the 1950s, is that there's also an understanding that Southeast Asians are a bit sensitive about, some of the cultural links or some of the cultural presumptions that Indians have about their link to Southeast Asia. So sometimes there's an understanding in India that Southeast Asians looking at India feel that, these Indians think that they're the cultural mother country because of Buddhism and Hinduism, and there's a tendency to maybe condescend to Southeast Asians. I think Indians know that they've got to treat the cultural link with Southeast Asia quite carefully, not to come across as patronizing or condescending. So I think that's one thing that sort of slightly gets in the way. But it's true at the same time that there's not a profound knowledge of the links between India and Southeast Asia amongst even elite people in India. It's Southeast Asia is more like a great tourist destination and playland. I think the other thing is that now Indians do kind of look up to Southeast Asia, because of Southeast Asia's economic successes. So that draws them to Southeast Asia. But the old cultural link that Dalrymple has so finely brought out, I think that's kind of not blossoming. And part of that is a part of Indian ignorance, part of Indian kind of trying to be overly sensitive about the cultural relationship. But I think it's also in Southeast Asia that there's not an enormous understanding in Southeast Asia of their Indic heritage and acknowledgement of it beyond a point. So in that sense, both need to probably work on it quite a bit more. And the links with China, by contrast, are very modern links in a sense. I mean, there are older links for sure, but the links now through TV, the Chinese diaspora, films, and of course education opportunities. So many Southeast Asians now study in Chinese universities and so on. And that, I think, has, the modern link with China is far more dynamic than with India. And part of that is that, China is just such an attractive place now economically, so that the gravitational pull of China is, 5 times that of India in terms of their economic size. But I think the other point that's not kind of acknowledged very much publicly is that, China has soft power in this region. And by that I mean that its political system, its form of governance, I think Southeast Asians look at that and go, gosh, there's something there. They've carried out this massive change over the last 40 years. Their governance system had something to do with it. It shows stability. It shows an ability to get things done in a way that other societies don't seem to be able to do. And I think a lot of Southeast Asians, admire that. When they look at India, though, the noise of India, the hubble and bubble of its democracy, doesn't necessarily resonate with all Southeast Asians that much. It's not that Southeast Asians don't like democracy, but India's messy, noisy democracy, which Indians know how to kind of interpret and understand and work with, I'm not sure Southeast Asians can make sense of it. They're like, why doesn't India get its act together? So I think China has that kind of soft power, oddly, because there's a view that, Western countries with democracy and openness and pluralism and all that have soft power over China. But actually a lot of the world is quite attracted to a practical authoritarian government that gets things done. And there are Southeast Asians, I think, who are drawn to that as well. I mean, no offense to anyone, but I think, getting things done, especially when you're economically still rising and hoping to grow, is attractive. And there are voices like that in India too. Should prefer a more authoritarian India, which gets things done. So I think, the relationship with Southeast Asia is quite complex culturally, politically. Economically, I think India would like to do more. But there is a problem there over services, particularly. I think ASEAN is not very hospitable to Indian services, and that's what India wants to push. India is not necessarily very competitive in manufacturing, so it doesn't do very well there. So I think the two sides still have to work through that problem on the economic side more.
Yeah. Are the Indians in general sort of aware that overall, what ASEAN has accomplished in this region is actually something quite remarkable? I mean, it is the most important thing is that in the most diverse region on planet Earth, among 700 million people, you have almost zero prospect of war between any two ASEAN countries today, which is quite remarkable. And at the same time, ASEAN's economy has grown enormously. I mean, in the year 2000, Japan was the world's largest economy. It was 8 times bigger than ASEAN. Now it's 1.3 times bigger than ASEAN. And by 2030, ASEAN will be, bigger than Japan. And so there's tremendous opportunities here in ASEAN. So I sort of wonder, since ASEAN ASEAN is an organization that threatens nobody. Everybody feels safe. It's like a cuddly bear you can hug, So would it be helpful for ASEAN to try, maybe quietly, discreetly, to arrange more meetings between Indians and Chinese. In the past, for example, when the Chinese and Japanese leaders couldn't talk to each other, they would come and meet at ASEAN meetings. And recently, for example, as recently as May 4th, the ASEAN finance ministers arranged a meeting with the ministers of China, Japan, and South Korea. And that enables, relations between China, Japan, and South Korea are not comfortable, but ASEAN provides a comfortable setting. So do you think ASEAN could try to do something similar and create meetings that brings together ASEAN ministers together with Indian and Chinese ministers? Would that help?
Well, ASEAN has done that, in fact, over the years. I mean, first of all, the ASEAN Regional Forum, ARF, has many countries in it, including China and India. So there have been meetings at that level. I think ARF has probably never quite blossomed the way everyone thought it would. But still, it's a structure that's still available. The second is the East Asia Summit, which was led by, Singapore and some other countries within ASEAN, and then ASEAN as a whole. And of course, there China and India meet as well. And generally, except in the last 3 or 4 years, after Galwan, when they would meet there, the Indian Prime Minister and the Chinese President would tend to have a sidebar meeting as well. So, it was an opportunity to have these kind of informal get-togethers between the two. I think, ASEAN's got advantages. It's kind of neutralist stand between the United States, China, and even India. Itself is a great. I mean, it resonates with both countries, both China and India, and so I think that's an asset that it could deploy to encourage further kind of contacts between the two. I think RCEP, to come back to it, was not just an economic agreement. I think ASEAN led it. Everyone now identifies it as being China's project, but it was ASEAN's project. And ASEAN pursued it not just for economic reasons, but also thinking that there would be spillovers into the geopolitics of the region. And that includes China and India. India opted out of RCEP, so that opportunity was gone. But I have a feeling India may drift back in, going back to my earlier remarks. So I think, ASEAN was a bit annoyed, I think, that India walked away from RCEP, but ASEAN could use that RCEP idea again, kind of cajole and persuade the Indians to come back, I think. And that might be a useful way to go. I think one idea that might work is if ASEAN could come up with a project, infrastructure, connectivity, economic, where Chinese and Indian participation would be vital, or at least very important. I don't know what that project is. It would take some thinking to come up with something. I think that might be, and just to come back to your earlier question about what India could do, I mean, culture apart, the political issues apart, and so on. The one thing that India could do to make an impact in Southeast Asia is to deliver on some big project, They've been trying to build highways, from Myanmar, which of course is stalled at the moment, all the way through to Vietnam. They've been involved in some port building in Southeast Asia, but never quite finished any of the projects that they were supposed to deliver on. I think India needs a big win in Southeast Asia, something big that Southeast Asians can look at and say, India delivered. So maybe a joint China-India project that ASEAN could come up with is something that would bring the two closer together.
Well, I'm very glad that we are ending on that happy note of suggesting a joint China-India project in Southeast Asia, because that would actually make the Southeast Asians very happy to see China and India, and we in Southeast Asia know that we have to live with China and India not for the next 100 years, but for the next 1,000 years. So we'll be eternal neighbors. So having a joint project within ASEAN, China and India, will be a huge breakthrough. But so, Kanti, thank you very much for all your thoughtful reflections, because I think this is a sort of dialogues we need to hear in Asia. Dialogues about how we can all come together rather than drift apart. And that's, in the end of the day, that's the goal of the Asian Peace Program and the Asian Peace Talks, to find ways and means for Asians to come together and work together and ensure that we don't go to war. With
Thank you
each
very
other.
much. I mean, maybe you could have one of these talks with a Chinese and an Indian participant simultaneously, and you moderate that discussion.
Yeah, that would be another excellent suggestion by you. So to conclude, let me say that the Asian Peace Talks podcast series is produced by Dr. Varigonda Kesava Chandra and Miss Kristen Tang, and is released by the Asian Peace Program, which is housed in the Asia Research Institute of the National University of Singapore.